Ladies and gentlemen, it is a real honor to be here this evening. I have a lot to say, so I'll try to discipline myself a little bit. I'm going to be trying to talk more on insights and perspectives rather than mind-bending numbers and dates and things like that. Because I think that to understand Russia, and I would submit that unless you grow up in Russian skin, you can only try to understand the Russians, okay? You spend a lifetime working at it, as I have, and never completely get it. Absolutely fascinating, complex, at times very, very troubling nation. Frankly, and I need to say this up front because I'm going to sound at times like a raving cold warrior, I fundamentally like the Russian people. I fundamentally like their aspects of their culture and their fine arts, and they have a lot of soul, very elemental. But I worry today that the promise that we saw in Russia in the 90s in the post-Soviet space is fading. And the country has, in fact, mutated into some very, very troubling ways. And we'll talk about that. This picture is emblematic of an interesting time because I don't know what the statistics are, but if you were to poll Soviet Union at this time and then the new Russian Federation in '91, American popular opinion of the United States was pretty high. I can't give you a number, but it was pretty high. 25 years, it's really low. I mean, and so whatever luster and whatever, and the Russians at this time were dealing with a whole lot of input and dealing with a whole lot of change. And while they were suspicious of us, resented us in many ways, were worried about the West, still, at that time, they saw the United States as representing, if you will, the positive aspects of liberal democratic business, a move to a better civil society, and that all launched in the 90s. But sadly, by the end of the decade, many of those precepts had been repudiated. You had this new group of oligarchs that had come up and had basically ransacked the national coffers and taken much of its industry and treasure, and it had turned into something increasingly troubling, though still better to work with than today. This period, again, 1990, it was, I was in the Army at that time. I'd been in for 9 years. And I look at the crowd. How many of you have been to Russia? Some of you probably. Do any of you speak Russian? Do you have, how many of you would say that you have a decent knowledge of Russian history? All right, because I just want to be able to try to talk all right, I'm going to go mainstream. My first mission was I was assigned to Fort Carson, Colorado. Fort Carson, Colorado was home of the 4th Mechanized Infantry Division, a heavy division as we called it, a lot of tanks and armored personnel carriers and artillery. And I was what they call basically I was working security and target acquisition and analysis for a nuclear-capable M109 155 self-propelled howitzer. And we trained for the Fulda Gap. And the mission was going to be that we would get indicators that the Soviet and Warsaw Pact, something was going to happen. We'd get on our airplanes, and then we would fall in on equipment pre-positioned in mostly in Germany, but throughout Western Europe. And we took it seriously. It was zero defect to the atomic codes and cookies and everything else. These artillery units fired what you call conventional rounds. But if it really, really got horrible and we were being overrun, then that unit and other units, we weren't the only one by any means, would be issued these nuclear weapons to fire 15 to 18 kilometers range at the advancing red hordes. That's, so that's what, 10 to 15 miles, 10 to 13, 14 miles. And we took it seriously, and that's how we were gonna defend against a breakthrough. How many of you have seen Dr. Strangelove in the last 30 years? All right? If you haven't or have never seen it, I tell my younger officers, I'm retired now, and younger students to watch it, because what is the heart of good satire? It's an element of truth. And that movie, in my mind, exemplified, when you pull back, step back, and look at mutually assured destruction, how absolutely, I'll use the word, mad it was. But it worked. And we collectively dodged a massive existential bullet, society, by getting out of the Cold War without launching weapons back and forth, because generally when nations have weapons, they eventually use them. And in that period, there was, incredibly detailed diplomats, professionals, technocrats, a whole legion of bureaucrats, really smart people, US and Russian, that would work these unbelievably complicated arms control deals that, besides trying to limit weapons and numbers, they also were confidence-building measures, and at many different levels. You had US and Russian arms negotiators. And while we didn't agree a lot, you had people talking. I would submit today that we had more people talking to the Soviets in the 80s and 70s on a broad range of subject than we do today. And I think that at this point, and while always being firm and protecting your allies and drawing our lines and just letting them know where don't do it, we need to start a better dialogue, because right now it is almost dysfunctional. And I think that's very, very important. If we get into one of these crazy situations in the world where you have all these airplanes and ships flying around, something bumps into each other, now you're headed into brinksmanship, and you want grown-ups that know each other talking to each other to get to kind of talk everybody, if you will, off the ledge. So I just brought this Economist article a little while ago, The New Nuclear Age. And I wanted to mention, and so this is now on people's minds. And the Russians, who are much smaller in capability, classical capability than the Soviets were, in numbers, are very, very lethal when it comes to nuclear weapons and high technology. And the point I'm trying to talk about with my time in Fort Carson as a young lieutenant and captain, with training and getting ready to use these if we had to, is we never want to go there again. We never, ever, ever want to get that close to the brink again. And so we have to today really put our heads into it and work to talk us out of this really sour, potentially dangerous environment with the Russian Federation. And I can't emphasize it. There's dialogue, but it's in my mind not adequate, and for all the reasons as I said. I wanted to start with that. Okay, and many of you I can see grew up in the Cold War, and you remember that time. And I think a lot of our youth today, by the way, we are not. I refuse to say that we're in a Cold War. The activities and the activities are increasingly Cold War-ish. In fact, you will say that relationships, there are those that seasoned diplomats will say that relationships, as far as sheer resentment and bile, haven't been as jangled as since the 1960s and the Cuban Missile Crisis. All right? So the Russians are not our enemy. Don't use that word. When one of our senior politicians called the Russians 2 years ago a foe, And words matter to the Russians. We got beaten to death with it mercilessly in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. And we're trying to talk, but you called us a foe. Words matter. Now, we're a free society, and we can say whatever we want. But our seniors, our politicians, the Hill and all that, need to be very careful in this high media, highly nervous environment about what they say about Russia. Russia has a mind, you've all read about it, mind-boggling disinformation machine, and will spin information in ways that would have made Goebbels proud. It is mind-boggling. I saw it personally in my 2 years there, especially as the Ukrainian and Crimea, the Ukrainian imbroglio began. So I'm a little off track, and let me get back on to what I wanted to say that right up front. Because I believe long term, if we can get through this period, if we can get through this very, very itchy, challenging period, in the long term, we actually have more in common with the Russians geostrategically than we don't. But there is so much animus and pent-up feeling in Russia in regard to the West, and in particular the United States, that it's hard to step back from it. Now, what will happen to many Americans like myself, and I first studied in the Soviet Union in 1989. I went to Russia, and I had, frankly, the time of my life. I went there as an army captain to a provincial city, and I was in a Russian Soviet university. While they were a little suspicious of me, they were really, really curious. I was a bit of like an exotic beast. They'd never seen a U.S. military person out in this, it was called Kalinin at the time. And a lot of these Russians actually became my friend, including my Komsomol overseer, okay? And got to really be in the culture a little bit, and then was in Russia a lot privately in the 1990s. So I like to think when I got tapped on the shoulder for Russia in 2012 to serve as our senior defense attaché, that I had doesn't mean that they're right, but at least some type of cultural connection. And I would try to, in everything I do, be balanced in how I assessed the situation. And again, I want to say that with the caveat that a lot of what Russia has done, especially in the last year, but also the things internally in its civil society in the years before, have been over the top and so out of line and so beyond the pale as far as international law. Regardless, we need to find a way to, again, without brinksmanship, is to find a way to bring them in, if it's even possible. And oh, by the way, one of the things that could happen is that Russia could, with its own contradictions, and you're hearing all about it with its economy and the and you know, it's tanked and they've become isolated, though it's still very rich. You have this 85% of Russian citizens that are in support of the government. And I would say, yeah, they're pretty proud Russians and very support our president. But over time, if the economy starts to corrode and the narrative isn't working for Russia internationally, Crimea is expensive, Eastern Ukraine is bloodier than they thought. The Russians are connected today, even with the increasing internet controls in ways with the world that couldn't have imagined in the 80s. And even toward the end of the Soviet Union, enough information came in to sway a lot of the population as far as the nature of their regime and the communist system. The Russians, again, I talked about it, have this extraordinary bodyguard of lies and their propaganda machine and their disinformation machine that does a good job of inoculating the Russian population from what we would submit is the real truth on a lot of issues. But eventually, when you have a society that's built on a kleptocracy, a pseudo-democracy that in reality is kind of a governance by mafia crime boss, and a cabal of very, very rich people and powerful people that basically that sacked much of the coffers of Russia, will eventually blow back on them. Eventually, their legitimacy is going to be called into question. It's not our business to be in regime change. I don't want to even get into it. But the Russians eventually, as happened in Ukraine, themselves, as they did toward the end of the Soviet Union, will start to see the false narrative. The Russian people today have a if you will, I believe, a social, sort of an unsaid social contract with the government. Undeniably, since Putin came into power in 2000, life for the average Russian, even with the crash in 2008, was substantially better. They got goods to market in normal, non-criminal distribution systems. They brought in a lot of Western distribution. There were better civil liberties, sort of, but always with that Russian edge. The Russians have this proclivity to keep dipping back into that authoritarian aspect of their society.